On the 8th of December 1980, John Lennon signed an album for a fan on his way to a recording session in New York with Yoko Ono, but when they returned to their apartment that night, the same fan stepped out and shot Lennon 3 times. The killer then sat on the steps of the building reading The Catcher in the Rye until the police arrived, and would later plead guilty to the murder. The death of John Lennon triggered an outpouring of grief internationally, and by the time the Formula One teams assembled in Long Beach in March, multiple singles by Lennon, as well as tributes, such as Roxy Music's cover of Jealous Guy, were still in the charts. Though in the UK, Just Like Starting Over had been beaten to the prestigious Christmas #1 slot by the St Winifred's School Choir and There's No One Quite Like Grandma. On the 20th of January 1981, the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, was sworn in, and 25 minutes later, the 52 American hostages that had been taken in Tehran during the Iranian Revolution were released. The Iran hostage crisis had blighted Jimmy Carter's last year in office and probably sealed his electoral fate, but his term had been characterized by a feeling of malaise in much of America after the Vietnam War and the oil shocks of the mid-70s, and former actor and California Governor Ronald Reagan was able to convince voters that he offered hope for the future, saying, "Let's make America great again." The day after the inauguration, the first DMC DeLorean rolled off the production line in Dunmurry, Northern Ireland. With its stainless steel body and gull-wing doors, it was certainly a striking car, and initial reception was good, while the placing of the factory in the outskirts of Belfast at the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland was a major win for the British government, who had partially funded the project. Colin Chapman of Lotus, meanwhile, had been working since 1978 with Detroit-born John DeLorean to develop the car. In Spain, the death of dictator Francisco Franco in 1975 had paved the way for the country's slow transition to democracy, a painful and slow process led by King Juan Carlos I, who had been named by Franco as his successor. The first free election since 1936 had happened in 1977, the new constitution was approved in 1978, followed by a new election in 1979. By 1981, the government of Alfonso Suárez felt a little aimless, having achieved its primary goals, and things were complicated by increased violence from the Basque separatist group ETA, an ongoing economic crisis, and elements within the Spanish armed forces who resented their loss of control and status. In February 1981, things came to a head as Guardia Civil officer Antonio Tejero burst into the Congress of Deputies gun in hand and took the entire assembly hostage. He claimed to be acting in the name of the king, but after a few tense days with tanks on the streets, Juan Carlos denounced the coup, and that was enough to bring it to a close. And in early March, prisoners at the Maze prison in Northern Ireland began a hunger strike, the latest stage of the protests that had been ongoing since 1976, when the British government had recategorised paramilitary prisoners from the IRA and similar groups, removing special category status, which was equivalent to being a prisoner of war, and treating them instead as violent criminals. The first prisoner to begin the strike was Bobby Sands, and on the 15th of March he was joined by a second prisoner, Francis Hughes, and more would follow. And so to Long Beach, where, aside from the fallout from the abortive Breakaway series, the talk was primarily of tyres. Goodyear had withdrawn from Formula One at the end of 1980, leaving Michelin as the sole suppliers, but the French company only had firm contracts with Renault, Ligier, Ferrari and Alfa Romeo, all FISA-affiliated teams. This meant, of course, that rumours were rife that these teams were being supplied with special tyres while everyone else was getting inferior rubber. Actually, they weren't, and indeed because Michelin now had to ration everyone's sets to make sure there were enough tyres to go round, Renault and Ferrari would no longer have the advantage they'd previously enjoyed of unlimited tyres. Over at Lotus, Colin Chapman was arousing some interest with the radical-looking new Lotus 88. The car was based around a concept of having two hulls, the basic monocoque with an engine, wheels and so on, but then, rather than being attached to the chassis, the bodywork was built as a separate unit, sitting on a set of springs attached to the suspension arms. At rest, the bodywork would hover at regulation ride height, but once underway, the downforce would push it down to allow the car to ride lower and use the ground effect. A single example had been brought for Elio De Angelis, with Nigel Mansell using the older 81 car, another of which was the spare. Brabham had a different and rather less visually obvious setup to achieve much the same thing. Gordon Murray had designed what he called hydrodynamic suspension, which again would hold the car at the regulation height at rest, but under downforce the car would press much closer to the track. Ferrari, meanwhile, were trying out different versions of the new turbo engine, one with twin KK&K turbos and one with a single Comprex drum. And while McLaren awaited their new MP4 chassis, Watson and De Cesaris would have to make do with the ageing M29F and weren't expecting a lot. De Angelis put in a few laps in the 88 on Friday, but several of the other teams had already protested the car, and that evening, with Bernie Ecclestone and Frank Williams both threatening to pack up and go home if the 88 was allowed to run, the decision to allow it was reversed. Chapman, rather annoyed, said he was sure it would all be sorted out by the next race in Brazil, but in the meantime Elio climbed into his 81 and did what he could in the year-old car that wasn't great to begin with. Street circuits often throw up a surprise or two in qualifying, especially near the start of the season when new cars are hit by all sorts of unforeseen teething problems. The Williamses, though, picked up right where they left off, with Jones and Reutemann leading the second session on Saturday, until right at the end, Riccardo Patrese shot round in his arrows to nab pole by just 9,000ths of a second. It was his and the team's first pole position, and he seemed as surprised as anyone else. Jones would start alongside on the front row, with Reutemann and Piquet behind, and the last drivers within a second of Patrese and Jones. Gilles Villeneuve was fifth in the Ferrari, first of the turbo runners, having finally settled on the KK&K units, and would line up alongside local hero Mario Andretti's Alfa, with Nigel Mansell impressing at the start of his first full season to put the Lotus 81 seventh, alongside an equally impressive Eddie Cheever in the Tyrrell. Several of the drivers who had been expected to be contenders found themselves in the midfield, Charrier laying out his stall for continued employment by putting the understeery Ligier 10th, 2 places ahead of Lafitte, Pironi down in 11th, De Angelis 13th after his disrupted Friday, the Renaults a disastrous 14th, Prost, and 20th, Arnoux, and Rebecca's second Brabham a disappointing 15th. The McLarens were back in 22nd and 23rd, De Cesaris out-qualifying Watson at the first time of asking, so Watson would start the race on the back row alongside Beppe Gabbiani's Ozella, with Kevin Kogan and Siegfried Storr both failing to make the cut despite their teammates' heroics. The Italian having an accident on Friday and then not running at all with an engine failure on Saturday, and the American becoming the first man ever to fail to qualify a Works Tyrrell. They were joined on the pit wall for the race by the 2 March drivers and Miguel Angel Guerra. They lined up neatly enough on the grid for the parade lap, but when they came back round for the start, several drivers, notably Reutemann, Mansell and Rosberg, were somewhat more off their line than the new FISA rulebook had in mind as they sought an advantage. When the lights went green, Patrese didn't make a mistake and got away in the lead, chased by the 2 Williamses, while Villeneuve went out to the left and got a good run along Shoreline Drive, and then coming up to Queen's Hairpin, braked super late to pass everyone and take the lead. In fact, he braked too late, got on the dusty bit and ended up right back where he'd started that manoeuvre in 4th. At the back, De Cesaris nudged Prost into Rebecca, who caught some air, but it was the Mexican who kept going, while the other 2 were out, jointly taking the dubious honour of being the first retirements of the year. Patrese was leading like he belonged at the front, leading from Reutemann, Jones, Villeneuve and Piquet, and was even pulling out a bit, while Pironi had attached himself to the back of Piquet's Brabham. Missed by the cameras on lap 4, Piquet passed Villeneuve, but then Pironi got past both of them to go up to 4th, neatly reversing the order of the Ferrari-Brabham-Ferrari sandwich, which was dropping ever further behind the top 3. Watson pulled in on lap 9 with a misfire in Cosworth and rejoined even further at the back, and then the next lap Rebecca came in, complaining of poor handling. They changed his tyres and sent him back out, but neither he nor the team realised that the anti-roll bar in his suspension had been broken in that first lap fracas. By now, Jones had dropped away from his teammate, who was still right on Patrese's tail, and the Pironi-Piquet-Villeneuve battle, still going hammer and tongs, was starting to catch the Australian up. Behind those 3 were the 2 Americans in the race, Cheever and Andretti, with Lafitte's Talbot Ligier in 9th at the back of the group. It was pretty obvious that Pironi was holding everyone up, and Nelson Piquet for one was keen to get past and head off in pursuit of Jones and the others. Arnoux was in next on lap 13, complaining of severe vibrations at the front, but even after turning the engine off and having a good look around, the team couldn't find anything wrong and sent him back out, dropping him from 15th to 21st in the process, and around the same time Elio De Angelis, running 11th, clipped a wall and had to retire with suspension damage. Piquet finally managed to pass Pironi again off camera on lap 17, and shortly afterwards, and apparently entirely unnoticed by the CBS director, Villeneuve's half-shaft gave up the ghost and he pulled off in the background of shot. Family honours would go to his brother Jacques, who'd come second in the Formula Atlantic support race the previous day, The CBS commentator said he'd won it, but that doesn't appear to have been the case. Jones put his foot down again, setting fastest lap on lap 19, and soon he was back with Reutemann, who still couldn't find a way past Prix. The pair lapped Watson, still spluttering along in last place and soon to retire, and Reutemann had a go at the Queen's hairpin on lap 24, but by now Prix was the one whose engine was sounding rough, and next time round the long shoreline drive the Argentine was able to simply power past and quickly leave the Arrows behind. With Jones also getting past shortly afterwards, Prix pulled into the pits, where his team diagnosed an ignition problem and replaced the spark box, returning him to the track 16th and 2 laps down. That left Reutemann and Jones in the lead, now with Piquet third, and a potential test case for the team orders clause in Reutemann's contract. A few laps later, Reutemann found himself behind Prix again, this time to put a third lap on him, as the Italian tried in turn to unlap himself from Chico Serra. Getting past the Arrows proved a bit easier this time, but still held Carlos up just long enough for Jones to get right on his tail. The two were matching each other incredibly closely. Alan Jones set what would turn out to be the fastest lap of the race on lap 31, and Reutemann, on the same lap, was just 9 thousandths slower, coincidentally the exact margin by which Jones had lost pole to Prix the previous day. Further back, the Battle of the Americans was still ongoing, with Cheever now up into 5th place in the Tyrrell, with Andretti and Lafitte still hanging on closely behind, the three a couple of seconds behind Pironi. Next on Reutemann's 2-lap list was Marc Sira in the Ensign, and while the Swiss driver proved no problem, no sooner was Reutemann past than he carried a bit too much speed into the Pine Avenue chicane, had to go wide, and Jones took the opportunity to nip past into the lead. With the cameras naturally watching that, they missed Lafitte passing Andretti for 6th. As Petrelli trailed in for another long pit stop and probably wondered why he was bothering at this point, up at the Williams pit a sign had gone out instructing Reutemann to not try overtaking Jones. A sensible precaution at a tight circuit, but whether the Argentine would develop a case of selective blindness when passing the pit boards was another matter. The pair put Arnoux and Rebecca another lap down, 2 more drivers having pretty miserable afternoons but still plugging away. Jones was already pulling away from Reutemann and rapidly established a gap of several seconds, while behind the Williamses were 2 pairs, Piquet and Pironi in 3rd and 4th, about 3 seconds apart, and Cheever and Lafitte running nose to tail in the 2 last points places. Jolly Jacques was all over the back of Fast Eddie, with Andretti still sticking with them too. CBS cut away to watch Jones for a bit, just in time to miss Lafitte colliding with the back of Cheever's car, rejoining the action as a very dishevelled-looking Talbot Ligier headed for the pits, then cut back to Jones, just in time to miss Lafitte turning into the pits and accidentally causing an accident between Giacomelli and Lammers, which put all 3 of them out. Jones, meanwhile, was lapping Jarier and the other Ligier, or at least trying to, despite Jumper's best efforts, while something in Cheever's gearbox seemed to have been knocked loose by the impact as he didn't have second gear anymore, not optimal on a circuit like this one. Andretti was all over the back of him and was soon passed, despite brakes that kept locking up at inopportune moments. With Pironi 4th also suffering from a fuel vaporization problem, it was starting to look like the key to success here might just be to finish the race. Andretti set about reeling in Pironi as the race entered its second half, and soon enough he was right behind. On lap 53 he went through on the outside at the Gazomet hairpin, to a cheer from the crowd, who were quickly silenced when Didier stood on the gas and used his turbo power to retake the place along Shoreline Drive. His fuel issues evidently coming and going. It was soon coming again, though, and the next time round Mario was passed even before the hairpin, and was far enough ahead that when Pironi floored it, he could get alongside, but not past. On the next lap it was Cheever's turn to come past Pironi, whose fuel problem was by now here to stay, and he was soon lapped by Jones, with Patrick Tambay and the Theodore up to 7th now, and scenting a point for Teddy Yip's new venture. In fact, the speed differential by the time he arrived was so much that he nearly cannoned into the back of the Ferrari. Hector Ribacchi caused a brief stir by spinning his Brabham to a standstill in the Pine Avenue complex on lap 59, ending up in a rather awkward spot, but gamely hopping out to assist the marshals in getting it out of the way. The following lap, Tambay got past Pironi off-screen as Jones extended his lead over Reutemann to 19 seconds and eased off a bit to conserve engine and tyres, holding station behind Cheever. Pironi didn't go much further, trailing in unhappily to retire on lap 68 as the race headed into its final stages. By lap 70 of the 80, Jones led Reutemann by 13.5 seconds, with Piquet 50 seconds behind the leader, Andretti 15 seconds behind the Brabham, then Cheever 12 seconds behind Mario and the last man on the lead lap, with Tambay, now having knocked his front wing askew, rattling over a curb, 6th. From there, it was a fairly uneventful last 10 laps to the end. Jones had slowed sufficiently for Arnoux to put on a late spurt and reduce his deficit to only 3 laps, and he and Chico Serra in 7th would prove to be the only 2 finishes outside the points, as Jones came home to take his 11th career win and Williams' third 1-2 on the trot, if you don't count South Africa in February, to begin his title defence in style. Both Williamses pulled up just past the finish line, and Jones, helped out of the car by race organiser Chris Pook, looked cheerful enough, as well he might, but Reutemann was not as happy. He'd done his duty for the team and not challenged Jones, but he felt he could have at the very least given him a race and quite possibly taken the win. There was a certain amount of tooth-sucking among the journalists in the aftermath of the race. A change in the technical regulations had been expected to shake things up a bit, so it was a bit of a disappointment from a neutral's point of view that the top 3 in today's race had been the top 3 in last year's championship. Those 3, and their team bosses, wouldn't mind, of course, and neither would Patrick Tambay and Teddy Yip, or Eddie Cheever scoring his first career points, and if the local fans would have liked to have seen Andretti on the podium, they could have some consolation with the first double points finish for American drivers since 1975, with Mario Andretti and Mark Donoghue. And so the teams packed up in the California spring to head to the Brazilian autumn and Rio de Janeiro in 2 weeks' time.